Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers. Dozens of people have been killed and hundreds more injured in violence that broke out in Chad yesterday. Prime Minister Saleh Kebzabo told a news conference that the government was still compiling casualties from what he describes as an armed insurrection. But human rights groups said unarmed civilians were massacred as security forces brutally cracked down on demonstrations in the capital, N'Djamena, and several other cities. It comes after pro-democracy protesters took to the streets calling for a swifter transition to democratic rule. The country is ruled by the military council led by President Mohamed Idris Deby, who took over following the battlefield death of his father, President Idris Deby, in 2021. Meanwhile, there's been international condemnation of the recent violence in Chad, where at least 50 protesters were killed in the pro-democracy protests. The UN, the EU, and the United States have called for all parties to de-escalate, but members of the opposition have vowed to keep protesting. In an unusual move, the U.S. Embassy in Chad not only issued a statement condemning Thursday's violence, but also posted a photo on its social media channels showing the ambassador kneeling next to bloodied clothes on the street. This came after people dressed as civilians cleared checkpoints and killed 4 people outside the embassy gates. It's not clear why the U.S. embassy was targeted. A curfew is in place in the capital, N'Djamena, and 3 other towns where protests took place. And at least 150 people have reportedly been killed in ethnic clashes in the last 2 days in Sudan's Blue Nile state that lies in the south. The fighting is said to be the worst in recent months. The violence broke out last week over land dispute between members of the Hausa people and rival ethnic groups in which more than a dozen people were killed. An overnight curfew was put in place to contain the violence. Meanwhile, fighting resumed between the Democratic Republic of Congo's army and the M23 rebels on Thursday afternoon and Friday morning in the Rutshuru territory of North Kivu province. A local civil society group is cited by the media as saying that the rebels first attacked the army's positions before the fighting escalated. The M23 has been in control of the border town of Bunagana and areas around it since June. In a statement, the rebels said the army launched attacks on their position on Thursday afternoon. This comes weeks after a Kenyan army contingent was deployed in the area following a decision by the neighboring heads of states to send a regional force to fight rebels in eastern DR Congo. Let's get more on this. We're now being joined by security expert David Otto, who joins us via Zoom from London. Thank you so much for joining us today on Network Africa.
Thank you very much, Educa.
Right, so let's begin with the unrest in Chad, where dozens have been killed and hundreds injured. What really do you think is the drive behind this violence?
Joke, I think this was inevitable. I think, as you rightly mentioned in the introduction, the moment that General Mohamed Idris Deby, that's the son of Idris Deby, took power with the alleged killing of, his father in the battlefront, of course, unconstitutionally, he took power, following that, announcement. It was very clear, that, there will be issues around legitimacy, because of course, he was not meant to be the one to take power. He was meant to be the head of the National Assembly. So there was a coup, and of course, he promised that he would have a transitional government for 18 months. That has now expired and it's been expanded. And he also made a very critical promise here, which cannot be forgotten, that he will not run in a democratic process. But both of those promises, have been, sidelined. And of course, the population is much aware, of the fact that, this is now a high level of distrust. And mind you, there is a very powerful coalition of, rebel groups some of which were responsible for the killing of, or alleged to have been responsible for the killing of his father. They had some settlements, which were meant to be agreed in Doha. It, hasn't gone down well. So there is a critical issue here. And, the killing of peaceful protesters, as I understand, is just perhaps, the beginning. But very worrying situation. Mind you, Chad is in a very strategic position. He plays host to the multinational joint task force and has played a very powerful role in countering insurgency with neighboring Nigeria.
Right, let's move quickly. We're covering, issues in 3 countries. In Sudan, at least 150 people have reportedly killed in ethnic clashes in the last 2 days. Do you see cultural diversity and ethnic differences at play here?
Of course, the situation in Sudan, which again, as you mentioned earlier on, took place around the Blue Nile, state and the West Kordofan area, has been, alleged to have been caused by land dispute. A very powerful rebel group, run by one Abdulaziz, Al-Hilu, has been blamed. His group has been blamed for these attacks. But again, it comes down to, what we call weather wars. Perhaps, wars that are fought over land. In this case, there is that accusation that there was an armed raid, on cattle, which, then, resulted in a dispute, and then eventually, these 2 ethnic groups, the Hausas and the Hamach tribes, engaged in a battle that led to the killing of a lot of people. I think critically, what we should note in this case is the information minister saying very well that part of this conflict, came as a result of propaganda, he said, from the social media. And he's been calling on people, who are using the social media to do that responsibly.
And today seems to be a spring of violence, as we've seen. We see fighting also resuming between the DRC's army and the M23 rebels. Both groups are accusing each other of striking first. What do you make of this situation?
Yes, as you said, it's been a week of violence. I mean, just beyond that, there's also been an ISIS, Allied Democratic Forces group that was accused of launching an attack in the same region. But of course, as you said, this has been a long-standing issue between the DRC, not just with the M23 rebel groups. Of course, we've always said before, and we keep saying this, that the M23 rebels, are not just from, perhaps as, the DRC says, from DRC Congo and from, Rwanda, but also made up of, rebels from Tanzania and also from Angola. But critically, on the issue here, I think there needs to be some resolution to this crisis. And as you rightly said, the Kenyan contingency, which was put forward by the former president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, they've now been deployed to the area. So we want to see some level of engagement. The president, Felix Tshisekedi, and his counterpart in Rwanda, had a very critical discussion, and they talked about being open, to discuss this crisis. But I tell you what, DRC is very poor in terms of governance. But what comes under the earth of that country is extremely rich. So I think we need to find some common ground very early enough, to stop this crisis in the eastern part of Africa.
David, we'd like to thank you for your time today on Network Africa.
Thank you.
Let's move on. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed says that the war in the northern Tigray region will end and peace will prevail. He made the remarks while inaugurating a talent development center in Oromia regional state. He urged Ethiopians to work together for the country's prosperity and not be divided along ethnic or religious lines. On Thursday, the Ethiopian government accepted an invitation by the African Union to participate in peace talks to be held on the 24th of October in South Africa to end the war that has killed an unspecified number of people and displaced millions. And British monarch King Charles III has condoled with Nigeria over the devastating floods that have ravaged the country in recent months. In a condolence message to President Muhammadu Buhari, the monarch said that he and his wife are deeply saddened about the situation. He sympathized with the victims, adding that his thoughts are with those working to support recovery efforts. The message reads in part, "I wanted you to know how deeply saddened both my wife and I are to hear of the many people who have lost their loved ones and those whose lives have been so dreadfully affected as a consequence of the devastating floods across Nigeria. Our most heartfelt sympathy is with those who have suffered so much, and our thoughts are with those working to support the recovery efforts." Nigeria is currently experiencing the worst floods in decades, with over 600 persons dead and 2 million people affected. Well, a mining company has evacuated its workers following attacks by Islamist militants at a neighboring mine in Mozambique's troubled Cabo Delgado province. The morning attack saw several families move to Montepuez town. Only employees thought to be essential to operations were left on site. Meanwhile, a local radio station reported that security forces were already in the area. Montepuez ruby mining is extracting rubies from one of the largest deposits of rubies in the world. In 2009, a vast deposit of rubies was discovered in northern Mozambique, and now half the world's red gemstones come from there. And a Ugandan court has sentenced an ivory dealer to life in prison, the longest sentence for such crimes in the country's history. A new law was passed in 2019 that toughened sentences for poaching or trafficking in endangered species. Pascal Ochiba was arrested in January this year with 2 pieces of ivory weighing nearly 10 kilograms. The magistrate said Ochiba, as a repeat offender, deserved life in prison for the future protection of wildlife. Let's move on to some other stories. A Spanish Coast Guard boat has transported 53 migrants to the port of Aguinquin in Spain's Gran Canaria after they were found traveling in a wooden boat in the Atlantic Ocean. The Red Cross says that the African migrants, which included 2 women and 1 child, were rescued 9.6 kilometers from the southern part of the island at about 9:55 a.m. Every year, thousands of people leave North Africa to make the perilous journey to Europe. Last year, about 4,400 people were lost at sea attempting to reach Spain, according to a monitoring group. Still to come on the program. Egyptian turns his gas-powered vehicle into an electric-powered car. See that story in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to cause problems to migrants all over the world, including in access to health and other social programs. Briefing journalists in New York, the chair of the Committee on the Protection of Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families, Edgar Corzo Sosa, said one of the problems is access to vaccines. The special rapporteur on the human rights of migrants, Felipe González Morales, also briefed journalists, saying that every year, as millions of people are displaced in the context of early onset disasters, the livelihoods of millions more are affected by slow onset environmental change and degradation.
Every year, as millions of people are displaced in the context of sudden onset disasters, the livelihoods of millions more are affected by slow onset environmental change and degradation. States should ensure that they respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of all migrants in the design and implementation of climate change-related migration policies. It's very important in this regard, the issue of access to regular migration, and I state in my report that I'm very concerned by the lack of pathways for regular migration, especially for climate change-related migrants, putting them at risk.
We continue seeing problems that the pandemic unfortunately caused. And these problems are, for instance, problems related to health access to be included in the social programs were a very difficult task, but also just to receive vaccines. Well, we have seen that there had been a special risk for children in the context of migration just leaving the country with all families. So they arrived to the country, some countries that are part of our international convention. So this is a great concern that we have, and just to say that they have to be treated with dignity.
The United Nations World Food Programme is delivering life-saving food and nutrition assistance to a record number of people in Somalia, with over 4 million people receiving urgent humanitarian support to prevent famine in the face of the region's worst drought in over 40 years. The scale-up has helped keep the worst outcomes of Somalia's hunger crisis at bay so far, but the situation on the ground remains dire, with lives and livelihoods being lost. WFP is racing against time to avert a projected famine and a death toll that could reach the tens or even hundreds of thousands.
WFP has massively scaled up our response in Somalia with the support of the international community. But the hunger and nutrition crisis is still very severe, especially in places like Baidoa, where we're still in a desperate race against time to avert looming famine. Unfortunately, despite incredible efforts, there's still so much to be done. We are only at the beginning of this crisis, and I fear the worst is yet to come.
Well, rice is a main feature on dining tables in Senegal and has become a major staple across West Africa. Senegal's domestic rice production may have soared in recent years, but efforts are being made to reduce residents' penchant for rice from overseas.
At a family-run restaurant in Dakar, Amy Gwe always tries to use imported rice. Customers, she says, prefer the taste.
If we cook with rice from the valley, some customers may not buy it anymore because of the stones and residues that can be found in it.
Around the continent and indeed the world, food security has been brought into sharp focus, in part by the global health crisis and war in Ukraine. Senegal has also fallen victim to the whims of the export market, having sourced 2/3 of its rice from India in 2021. However, last month, India, fearing its own food shortages and rising inflation, curbed rice exports. This forced Senegal to look inwards. That can be seen in the country's north, where neat paddy fields form a mosaic near the town of Dagana. There, the Japanese development agency JICA has been helping the Senegalese rice sector for over a decade. The current phase of the project is on improving quality, less broken kernels and grits. The project's team leader, Yoshihiko Ogata, says he doesn't think there's any difference in the potential for growing rice in Senegal compared to Japan.
お米の生育としては日本もセネガルも変わらないと思います。ただ農家さんの
I think what's the difference is the attitude of farmers towards rice growing. But I think that will change. Japanese farmers are emotionally invested in their rice crop. They put a lot of love into it and respect.
稲に対して愛着を持って接している。あるいは非常に稲に対してリスペクトとして栽培を行っていることが。
But the effort could be worth it, not only for improving food security, but also economic security. Following the global food price crisis in 2007 to 2008, Senegal's rice production has accelerated. But according to UN data, consumption more than doubled over the same period to 1.9 million metric tons. That was driven by a growing population and an increasing preference for rice over other grains, meaning that even with significant gains in production, the rice sector looks set to remain under pressure for some time.
At least 10 million children are suffering from the worst climate-induced droughts the Horn of Africa has seen in 40 years. The number of drought-hit people without reliable access to safe water is rising fast. UNICEF is on the ground responding to the drought emergency by supporting countries in the region in the sectors of water, sanitation and hygiene, nutrition, education, child protection, among others. UNICEF's Goodwill Ambassador Priyanka Chopra Jonas has been visiting Turkana County to meet people in affected communities, communities affected by drought, and to witness firsthand UNICEF's efforts and their results.
UNICEF, as you've been told, has helped us.
Let's move on to other stories. Ali Al-Said, an Egyptian teacher, has turned his gas-powered 1985 Fiat into an electric-powered car. This followed his inability to fuel his car owing to rising energy prices. Al-Said says he's happy with the results he got.
This Egyptian teacher may not be driving the latest Model Y Tesla, but instead has turned his 1985 Fiat 127 gas-powered car into an electric one to save on rising fuel prices and resort to a more environment-friendly mode of transportation. The 51-year-old teacher, Ali Al-Said, bought a used Fiat 127 a year and a half ago for only 10,000 Egyptian pounds, but couldn't afford the rising cost of fuel for long. The electric battery cost him nearly 6 times the car's original price, but Said believes it was a worthy investment.
I used to fill my car with fuel every 2 days for a certain amount of money. Not a lot in the beginning, but with increasing prices, the price of fuel needed for 2 days has doubled. It was problematic for me because I use it a lot. I love to travel. It was hectic.
وتبقى مستقبلا اقدر اسافر بيها امشي مسافات كبيره 200 و300 كيلو.
Now it only costs him 10 Egyptian pounds to power the car's battery for 100 kilometers. He charges his car once a week. Over the past few years, Egypt has phased out subsidies on most fuel products as part of an IMF-backed economic reform program. In July, Egypt further raised domestic fuel prices by 0.50 Egyptian pounds for 80-octane and 92-octane petrol, adding more pressure on inflation.
Quello che ha detto Xavier, ha parlato di suo papà e appunto lui è qui per seguire il musico, David Gerard, Pascal Delacour.
Now to cars that's probably not running on electricity, but they are faster than the one you just saw. The Africa Eco Race 2022 is now underway despite dangers and threats from rebel groups in Western Sahara. The race from Monaco to Senegal invokes the spirit of the Dakar Rally, which moved from Africa in 2009 due to the security concerns in Mauritania. The Africa Eco Race 2022 officially began with a night start in Monaco on Saturday. Participants then boarded a boat ready for the first race stage on Tuesday, October 18, from Nador to Boussaid in Morocco. After the first stage, France's David Gerard led the kart and truck category. Gerard held on to the lead throughout the second race, which took racers from Boussaid to Tagounit in Morocco. It was an all-French top three as Philippe Gosselin came in second and Loic Freiberg in third position. The race will pass through Morocco and Mauritania, ending in Dakar, Senegal, on October the 30th. A number of the cars taking part are equipped with solar panels. riding in the desert and making use of the sun to power those cars. Smart thing to do. Well, that's it on Network Africa. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Joker Rogers.